to make sure everything comes out right. We may have had an operator error earlier, but for everyone here, I'd like to introduce Dr. McNulty, Evenie's father. Evenie's very excited as well that you're here, that she's here actually. But he did a presentation last hour. It was about maybe 20 minutes, and it was absolutely great, talking about so many things that we've talked about Africa, and I learned a lot from it. I'm recording it so I can use it in future years because it was so great. So I really appreciate it, Dr. McNulty, and the screen is yours.
All right. Well, I'm happy to be here and happy to talk to everybody. I'm going to share my screen so you can see my PowerPoint slides. Is that coming through?
Yes, it is.
Great. So I'm a professor of anthropology at the University of Minnesota. And so during the school year, I teach classes at the university, but during the summers and between semesters, I actually do research in Kenya. And what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the geography of Kenya and of Eastern Africa in general, just to give you a sense of some of the different factors that play into how the peoples in Kenya live today. So I'm an anthropologist, and what that means is that I study people and everything related to people. And anthropologists study everything from culture to cultural remains to biological remains. And I'm very much on the side of a biological anthropologist. And in particular, I'm interested in paleontology. And so the fossil record that tells us about humans and the evolution of humans. And when you put all of that together, what you end up with is a paleoanthropologist. And so my work in Kenya is paleoanthropology, trying to document the fossil record of humans and our relatives. And that's what takes me to Africa. And as a paleoanthropologist, when I think about Africa, the first thing I think about is the prehistory, the natural history of Africa as a continent. And many of you know that the continents shift around over time. And if you look at this snapshot from 50 million years ago, you can see that Africa is actually an island isolated by itself in the middle of the oceans. Gondwana land is broken up and Africa is kind of floating off on its own. And it's isolated from the rest of the continents for about 150 million years. And what that means is that in those 150 million years, Africa evolves its own unique animal and plant communities. But the animals and plants in Africa at this time are completely different from those that we see in other parts of the world. And so we get a very unique set of animals and plants there. And if you fast forward to about 20 million years ago, you can see Africa has now moved up into its current position and it's connected to Europe and Asia. And what happens when that connection occurs is that animals and plants from Africa start to move out into Europe and Asia. But it also means that animals and plants from Europe and Asia move into Africa. And this creates an incredible set of interactions in these animal and plant communities as new organisms are coming into contact with things they've never come into contact before. And that dynamic interplay is what's led to the really interesting and diverse sets of ecological communities that we have in Africa today. So that's one big part of the natural history of Africa. Another big part has to do with something we call rifting. And all of Eastern Africa is affected by these rift systems. And if you look at this map here, there we go, all of these lighter greenish yellow areas, these are all rifts. And rifts are simply big cracks in the crust, places where the crust has dropped down significantly. And so we think of rifts as this depression in the landscape, but in fact, before the rift occurs, what happens is the landscape bubbles up. And so the entire crust, which has a heat source underneath, gets higher and higher and higher, and it eventually gets so high that it cracks, and then it drops down into a rift. So while we think of rifts as being low points in the landscape, they're actually low points in a much, much higher area. Now, that has really important implications for what happens in Eastern Africa in terms of its climate. So let me back up again to about 50 million years ago. About 50 million years ago, Africa would have been covered almost completely by what we call a pan-African forest. Lots and lots of precipitation in Africa, usually coming in off the Indian Ocean. You also get precipitation off the Atlantic Ocean. And because there's so much precipitation, we can get lots of plants growing, and we have these very broad forest communities. That's about 50 million years ago. About 25 million years ago, when we get that rifting start, the landscape in East Africa bubbles up, it starts to crack, and you get these high mountain ranges in Eastern Africa. What that means is these storms from the Indian Ocean can't get into the interior of Africa. They're blocked by those mountain ranges that are caused by the rifting. And so what happens over the last 20 million years is that with less and less precipitation, Africa dries out. If you look at the vegetation today, there's only a narrow belt of forest where once most of the continent would have been forest. Instead, we now have these very dry regions just because of this rifting going on in East Africa. Another part of the African cultural history is this incredibly complex set of migrations. And we can track that to some extent looking at different language groups. So this map is showing you some of the major language groups in Africa. And we can track some of these historically by looking at these little pockets and trying to understand how those little pockets ended up in places that are otherwise surrounded by much larger language groups. And so of particular interest to me working in Eastern Africa is this Bantu language. And the Bantu people or Proto-Bantu people started out here in Central Western Africa. And about 5,000 years ago, they migrate both eastward and southward. And the Bantu people have incredible success due to their advances in agriculture and pottery and tool making. And so these Bantu peoples actually go in and their cultures start to intermingle and replace a lot of the other cultures that are in these areas. A few thousand years later, we get Nilotic speakers and Cushitic speakers, so populations from up here in the Nile River area. And these groups also start to expand and migrate. And then we have more recent migrations in from Arabia, across Northern Africa, and then lots of European languages that I'll talk about in a minute. And these all kind of constrain where these different language groups end up. But what's interesting, if you look at Eastern Africa, is that this is a place where we have this real juxtaposition of different language groups. Cushitic languages, Nilotic languages, Bantu languages. There's even a little pocket of the ancient Khoisan language here in Tanzania. So Eastern Africa is this place where all of these different cultures are intermingling. So when you think about these complex migrations, the result has been an incredibly diverse patchwork of different ethnic groups. And you can see in this map all of the different ethnic groups that were mapped out about 3 decades ago. And you can see every one of these colors is a different group, and it's incredibly diverse. So this has been going on in Africa since modern humans originated there 300,000 years ago. And so over these hundreds of thousands of years, all of these different groups have been evolving, changing with their landscapes, changing as they migrate around, changing as they interchange cultural artifacts and information with other groups. And this has evolved into a very stable system of different cultures and ethnic groups all around Africa. You've already talked, I think, about colonialism and some of the impacts of colonialism, but one of the really devastating effects is that you have these systems of culture in place, and these systems that have evolved over hundreds of thousands of years. And colonial groups come in and they superimpose on top of those systems a culture that's completely alien. And so these very stable systems are suddenly forced into a system that's alien to what they've been doing and that did not evolve in the landscape with these peoples. And the results have been really tragic for a lot of groups in Africa. If you look at the map of the different colonial regions in Africa, you can see the French colonized most of Western Africa, the British most of the eastern side and Southern Africa, And then other European powers colonized different areas. And if you think about that earlier map, and in fact, I'll fade this one out so you can see all of these different ethnic groups are now somehow confined into these larger colonial government areas. And the result is that you're telling peoples who have been interacting in a specific way that suddenly they all belong to a single group. And you can imagine this as if somebody told your family that you no longer can act like your own family. You now have to work with a dozen other families, and all of you have to interact in exactly the same way. This is what colonial powers did. And so all of the traditions that you have in your family are no longer allowed. You somehow have to work it out with all of these different other families. Obviously, that wouldn't work for your family. And in the same way, this hasn't worked for the different populations in Africa. And I want to point out, even though most of these colonial governments are no longer in place, we have other types of colonialism that still occur in Africa. Things like economic colonialism, where economic powers are superimposing their own systems on these different governments. We can even think of philanthropic colonialism, where groups that are trying to do good, for example, by donating clothing. We have lots of organizations in the US that will donate clothing and ship it over to Africa. And that seems like a good thing for people in developing nations, maybe don't have enough money to buy clothes all the time. But what it means is that we're taking clothing that we have here and we're sending it over to a place that already had industries that made clothing. And we're putting those industries, those local people, out of business because we're sending free clothing over there. And so even philanthropy, even trying to help people out, we have to be very careful about how we intervene in these complex systems because intervening can have devastating consequences. So let me zoom in for a snapshot of Kenya. And what you're looking at here, this dark black outline, is the country of Kenya. And you can see the different tribal groups. There are more than 40 tribal groups in Kenya, again, all because of colonialism, all told that they belong to a single country and need to work together. And Kenya's been a very stable country since they gained their independence in the 60s. But nevertheless, there are problems associated with all of these different groups trying to act as a single unit. One interesting thing in terms of the geography, the physical geography, if you look at the population density of Kenya, over in this right-hand map, you can see where these spikes are. That represents higher and higher population densities. And so this tallest spike is Nairobi, the capital city. This large spike is Mombasa. But you can see this belt across here where it's very heavily populated. And if you superimpose the water availability on top of that, you can see they correspond almost perfectly. In other words, the availability of fresh water, and there you can see both maps now, the availability of fresh water is very much driving how people are settling Kenya. And that's due, as I mentioned before, to this drying out of Africa due to the rifting system. And so as Africa got drier and drier, the availability of water became a key resource that tends to dictate how people are able to populate the areas. So let me end by zooming in even further, specifically to Western Kenya, this area here on the shores of Lake Victoria. And this is where I do my research. And I work specifically with the people called the Luo. And the Luo are a Nilotic group. So they would have, a long time ago, originated way back up here around the Nile River, but migrated thousands of years ago into this area. And the Luo are a great example of how different geographical factors can impact the way people live and how their cultures work. So traditionally, the Luo were pastoralists, meaning they were animal herders. And so they would have kept cows and goats and sheep, and they would have moved from place to place with those, finding better grazing lands. But 400 or 500 years ago, a really bad disease wiped out most of their livestock. And so most of the herds of cattle all died out. And this left the Luo with scrambling to find a way to maintain a living. Well, because they lived on Lake Victoria, what they did was they turned to fishing. And Lake Victoria historically has been full of lots of different kinds of fish. And the Luo are now famous for their fishing trade. They're excellent fishermen. They're some of the only people in Kenya, at least, that actually swim regularly. Much of Kenya, the waters are filled with crocodiles, so it's not a great place to swim, but Lake Victoria is actually fairly safe, and the Luo fish and swim and utilize the water in a very significant way. So Lake Victoria is not only great for fishing, but it's also great for trade. Once you have boats, you can move around very easily. You can migrate, you can trade with other ethnic groups and other populations. And so it really facilitated this exchange of cultures and ideas and industry all around the lake. Today, more than 40 million people live around this lake. Now, this is a massive lake. It's the second or third largest lake in the world. So very big, but still 40 million people all rely on the lake to provide them with sources of food and sources of livelihood. It also has one of the highest growth rates in the world at 3.5%. And if we think about how this has impacted the people, the Luo started, once their herds died out, they started as subsistence fishers. In other words, they were fishing in order to get enough food to eat. Once colonial powers superimposed different economic processes, they transformed from subsistence fishermen into commercial fishermen. In other words, not just catching fish for themselves, but now trying to catch it to sell so that they have money to buy what they need for their family. Once you enter the commercial fishing market, then you're suddenly linked to the global market. And so the price of fish around the world in some sense dictates how much you can sell your own fish for. And we saw this with the price of tilapia in the last 20 years. The fish tilapia has become so much higher priced because so many people want to eat it, that it's become more and more profitable for fishermen to go out and catch more and more tilapia. As people start fishing more and more, the fish populations go down, and then they have to go further and further out to catch their fish. And so where they may have only gone out for the day to catch fish and come back, now they may go out for a week or 2 weeks. And so they're moving further and further. And as we've seen in the last year, one of the things that really facilitates the transfer of disease is further and further movement and interaction among people. And this is the same thing has happened in the Lake Victoria area, where all of these 40 million people around here, as they move further and further to catch fish, are spreading diseases like HIV/AIDS. And so this whole area has become devastated by the HIV/AIDS pandemic long before we had a coronavirus pandemic. So this is just one example of how all of these different geographic factors can impact people's lives. Living on the shores of Lake Victoria, giving them access to one way of living, but also how the economic powers that were superimposed on them caused them to change the way they fished, fishing instead of for subsistence, for commercials, and how that further then exacerbated the spread of disease. And the result has been pretty devastating. So that in the place where I work, for example, there's a very high incidence of orphans because there's so much disease. And so part of my work, in addition to finding fossils, is I work with a local group there that helps support and educate these orphan children. But all of that is a result of these different geographic factors. So with that, I will stop, and I'm happy to answer questions if there are any or not.
Any questions? Well, once again, I would say in typical eighth grade fashion, there's not a lot of questions here. However, that was just great, and I believe I did it the correct way this time. So, so I really am grateful, and thank you very much. And like I said, I can't wait. I'm going to use this in future years to come. It was a great presentation. I really appreciate your time and you putting the presentation together for us.
Great, happy to help.
All right, have a great day. Thank you,
You too.
Dr. McNulty. Bye-bye.
Bye.